So, Dr. Alteri, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with myself and our audience about the coronavirus. As everybody knows, this is it's on everybody's mind. It's on the news. It's a major epidemic here, or pandemic. First of all, why don't you start off and just explain to people your credentials? What makes you qualified to speak on this?
Sure. Well, first, thank you for having me do this, and I think it's very important to share reliable information with the public, and so that's very important to me in my mission, and so I appreciate this opportunity. I think, my credentials are basically that I'm a microbiologist, and I study, my area of expertise is bacterial pathogens. But I do also know a reasonable amount about epidemics and viruses and other infectious agents. And so I've spent the past 20 years studying various pathogens and understanding mechanisms by which they cause disease.
So a lot of people too, are watching this. It's a movie show. We usually are talking about movies and reviewing movies, and it's all a little bit more upbeat kind of messaging. But this has crossed over into the movie industry as well. The James Bond movie was pushed back due to fears of the coronavirus from April to November. They canceled the South by Southwest Festival. As we're doing this talk right now, they had just confirmed the first cases of coronavirus in Michigan. Please help us. What do you think is the most important thing that average people need to know about what's going on right now?
Yeah, I think that's important. So I think there is some good information out there, and so I think there's a lot of common sense actions that we can all do to help, control the spread of this new coronavirus. Washing your hands, not touching your face, limiting going to places where crowds congregate, which is exactly what you just described, which I think is very important. In fact, chances are very good that we'll cancel face-to-face classes on our campus here in the very near future to help mitigate the spread of this virus. And so I think those are really key, because what we're really talking about is protecting vulnerable people, right? And it may not be you or I who are at risk of severe infection, but there are people with underlying conditions or elderly people that are at much higher risk for a severe infection. And so I think we should really be thinking about this in two ways. We're protecting ourselves from getting infected by washing our hands and not going to these kinds of gatherings, but what we're really doing is we're protecting those vulnerable people who might be hospitalized due to this infection. So I think people need to understand that it's not just your decisions don't just affect you. We're actually trying to protect many others, and your actions as an individual are critical in that effort. And I think the other thing, to point out about Hollywood is, there is actually a movie that I show to my immunology class about something very similar called Contagion. I'm sure you've
absolutely
heard about this. And so I just would like to spend a second talking about that, because there are aspects of that movie that are very realistic, and others that are sensationalized.
Sure.
The virus and the way the people were dying and all that was very unrealistic.
Sure.
But the response to this new pandemic in that movie has many parallels with what we're seeing now. We see people with cures on the internet. We see conspiracy theories about where this thing came from. We see all that stuff was in the movie as well, as we're contact tracing someone who's infected. Who did they come into contact with? Let's get them tested, and that. So a lot of that, those are real world experiences that you can see on the big screen if you watch that movie, and just realize that some aspects were very sensationalized, but there was a core of very good information in that movie that's very similar to what's going on now.
And it's interesting too. It's no surprise to anybody to say that we're living in a very polarized time, in an era where people don't believe a lot of the news that they're seeing. What advice can you give people who want to know? I mean, part of the reason why I wanted to talk to you directly is, I'd like there to be somewhere where people can know with confidence that they can turn to find out real information. You mentioned, there's people trying to take advantage of this on the internet, and just the barrage of news, people not believing this thing. I feel like there's an element of like the boy who cried wolf. There's been so many things that we've been scared about, or made to be scared about in the past that have turned into nothing, and now there's actually something that might affect our lives, and everybody's like, what can you speak to finding the truth, and where can people look to find this information?
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent point, and I think I am very concerned about some of the way the information is being disseminated or is not being disseminated. There are, the CDC is a very good resource. WHO is another very good resource for basic information. And the truth is, and I think this is, in a way is exploited and by certain sides of the media, is that, scientists like myself, public health professionals, clinicians, we need the numbers to be able to say with any degree of certainty, this is what's going to happen or that's what's going to happen. The fact is, this is a newly emergent virus into the human population. So we don't know many things, right? And we do have some numbers that are coming in and so on. And so we can sort of guesstimate things like a mortality rate,
yes,
and things like how many people might be infected. But the truth is, you don't know the actual details of that until after, right?
Yeah.
So I think what's important for people to understand is it's much better, I think, to potentially overreact and then, it wasn't that bad after all, then,
sure,
well, it's going to be nothing, but, lots of people die all of a sudden because we didn't act. I'd much rather be on the side of being proactive and mitigating a potential issue that turns out to be nothing than something we think is nothing turning out to be a huge problem,
sure,
and we didn't do anything about it. So I think that's sort of the common sense approach. And I think, the other thing I would like to point out about this is, we have not had a major pandemic in many, many years, right? We had the swine flu, H1N1, about 2009. That wasn't a massive pandemic, but it was more of a scare, I would say. But good to be proactive there, and it turned out to be nothing. But,
sure,
the 1918 influenza pandemic, that was 100 years ago, or over 100 years ago. We don't remember what that's like.
Right.
The polio epidemic, right? One of our, major figurehead presidents of all times, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was paralyzed in a wheelchair from polio. Polio epidemics. We haven't, right? We've sort of forgotten what these things are like, or our memory is dwindling. Sure. And so I think, there's an element of complacency in what you asked is, we haven't experienced any of this, so we tend to want to think, it's no big deal, nothing's going to happen, because we haven't lived this in a very long time.
You spoke to the virus itself. What can you tell people about the virus? Because again, sometimes words just kind of take on their own meaning. The word virus gets out there, coronavirus, and then everybody just keeps repeating it without really knowing what it is. What can you tell people specifically about this virus? What makes it different than other things that are out there? Kind of talk about the actual, virus itself.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. So there's nothing actually special about this coronavirus, which is called SARS-CoV-2,
okay,
right? Because it's closely related to the SARS epidemic that we're familiar with. This is SARS coronavirus 2. And the disease it causes is being called COVID-19.
I see.
So the virus is SARS coronavirus 2. There's nothing special about it, frankly. The only special thing here is that SARS coronavirus 2 has never been in people before.
I see.
So there's nobody with immunity to it. Nobody's seen it before. Nobody's immune system has seen it. Everybody is potentially susceptible to this. which is different than, say, influenza virus, which we see every year, year after year. Now, influenza does some interesting things to change every year, which is why we need a new flu vaccine every year. But nonetheless, we do have a flu vaccine every year. People are exposed to flu all the time. People have various degrees of immunity to flu. It's not a new thing in the human population. So I think that's the difference, is really not the virus. The difference is human beings have not been exposed to this virus before, and so that makes more or less every human being susceptible to being infected. Whereas with influenza, which spreads very similarly, some might even argue it causes more severe disease than a coronavirus. Influenza, people have gotten flu. People have immune responses to flu. People get vaccinated to flu. So, I think that's the big difference, really, is this coronavirus is just new into the population.
Again, this might coming from someone who doesn't know anything about this. Maybe this is a dumb question, but like you mentioned the flu. The flu doesn't just go away. It's more like humans have kind of learned how to cope and adapt to flu shots and being able to kind of control it through vaccines and things like that. What's the future of the coronavirus? Is this going to just disappear one day, or is it going to be part of our future where we're just going to what do you think the future is of this?
I mean, that's I would have to be highly speculative to answer that question,
Okay.
and I just want to point that out. We
Sure.
have no idea what's going to happen with this. But what we do know about coronaviruses in general, there's many coronaviruses, and many different animals have coronaviruses, including us. In fact, approximately a third of the common colds that we get is probably a coronavirus. There's a handful of viruses, different viruses that cause colds, and coronavirus is one of those that causes the cold. So this coronavirus is similar because it's a coronavirus to the ones that cause the common cold, but this is new into people, which is making it dangerous. And one possibility is that this SARS coronavirus 2 just becomes part of this mix of circulating viruses that cause colds and severe respiratory infections, and this just is one of those that's with us now. Since it's made the move into humans, maybe it stays. The other possibility is, when enough people are exposed and become immune to it, then it just sort of peters out, doesn't have anybody to infect, and maybe it just sort of goes away. More like the SARS coronavirus 1. But the truth is, these things are very good at transmitting, and if a virus has a goal, its goal is to transmit to people, and it has to take over machinery of our own cells to do so. So I think, if their goal is to transmit, then they're either going to become a virus that is able to transmit and cause very mild disease and infect as many people as possible, and I would consider that like our regular cold viruses, or it stays sort of more severe as it is, and it just sort of infects enough people where we generate enough immunity and it has nowhere to go, and it just sort of peters out. But I think the real message here is also the emergence of viruses from animals into humans. I think that's another thing that shouldn't be overlooked here. And as we, as humans, increase in population, we encroach in more natural habitats, and we degrade more natural habitats. I think the frequency with which these zoonotic diseases move from animals to humans may well increase, and we may see.
This could be the tip of the iceberg in terms of things that
this could be. And
transfer
I don't mean to be alarmist in any
Right.
way, but that's I think one lesson to be learned here is that these things can happen, and we need to be prepared. And how are we prepared? With good public health policies, shutting down these kinds of large gatherings, making sure people are washing their hands, protecting our vulnerable population, keeping people at home who are elderly, and that sort of thing.
Putting it in context, though, when people are told to wash their hands, stay at home, avoid large gatherings, is the goal in doing that, not simply just to prevent the spread of the disease, but is the goal to buy time to allow the scientific community to establish these vaccines, or get enough tests into the market, or the testing kits, or like what's the underlying goal? Because like you said, we can't stay indoors forever. Nobody
Right. So
wants to play.
no, that's a great question. So sorry to interrupt that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I think the virus's goal is to transmit, and so our goal as public health professionals is to block transmission.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what washing your hands and staying at home and not going to these gatherings, right? What we're trying to do is interrupt transmission, to limit the number of cases, to limit the exposure to vulnerable people. That's the name of the game here. And so, it's not necessarily to buy time to create something else. It's to limit the spread and block transmission, to protect vulnerable people. That's really the goal here. And I think there are already, I think the swine flu pandemic, the recent Ebola outbreak, those all sort of nudged us towards where we are today, where we're a little bit better prepared to deal with the pandemic and shut down things and work from home and so on. So I think every time one of these things happens, it behooves us to just make this easier next time this happens, because there will be a next time, right?
Sure, absolutely.
And we need to learn from our experiences. So I think that's the important thing.
In terms of, flatly, basically what we know right now with this coronavirus, and of course the information that's being provided to the public could change as we learn more about it. When we're seeing, being in Michigan, and we're seeing, other states take these measures, and then in our state, like you mentioned, with Michigan State, as the day that we're taping this, they announced that they're not doing any face-to-face classes, I think for April at least. Mm-hmm. As things get closer and closer to home, tying it back into the fact that we're a movie show, something like a movie theater is a place where people are like, well, there's a theater full of, people, and, maybe that's a place to avoid. Are we at a point where we should be avoiding like any kind of gathering? Like, is that the recommendation right now? Or do we wait for people to get infected then pull back?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. So, the answer, my answer is it's always a good idea to be safe. And so, yes, I would say, avoiding large gatherings is always a good idea. Now, if you don't have vulnerable people in your household and that sort of thing, your risk assessment might be slightly different than someone who's caring for an elderly person or has young kids at home. And so I think, I do think there is some element of, individualism that, in that decision-making process.
Okay.
But I think it's prudent right now to assume there are infected people all around, and you want to limit your exposure and interrupt that transmission from those infected people to uninfected people. And the way to do that is to avoid gatherings. Social distancing is important. Okay. And if you do, go to these places, right, wash your hands, use sanitizers and things, wipe down the areas where you're at. Don't get very close to someone, especially if they appear to might have a cold or something like that. I think those are all prudent measures to interrupt transmission. And I don't really think it's out of bounds to think, well, we've got a case in Oakland County and we've got a confirmed case in Wayne County. It's not unreasonable to think that there are many other cases in Oakland County and Wayne County and not just those two.
From what I've heard, and I don't know this to be true again because it's coming through media sources and things that, all this bevy of information that just kind of flows through. But there's reports that, while children can transmit the disease, as far as the mortality rate goes, we haven't really seen a lot of cases in children. Do you think that this is just it's a little too early? Like, it's probably going to show that there's no difference with children versus adults in terms of the effects of this virus, or do you feel like it's just something that's being underreported?
Yeah, it's really hard to know. So, I think this is a perfect example of we need to know all of the numbers, and then we can say what happened, right, after the fact. It's very hard in real time to do that. But what the numbers that we do have do suggest that either it's less severe in young people, in infants and children, or they are infected to a smaller degree, or maybe they're just a group that's always getting colds and things, and we just they may have had coronavirus or not, and it's just how do we know?
Right.
So I'm not sure if that's going to hold or not. What is absolutely true is that elderly people are at risk. People with hypertension appear to be at risk. Diabetes, those are the kinds of underlying conditions that would put you at risk. And of the numbers we have now, 60 and older seems to be a much higher risk group than anyone else.
And is it just because this virus is so severe that they're being older, you just can't take it? Or
I mean, generally
underlying...
speaking, that is true.
Yeah.
And this is why usually it's infants and very young kids and very elderly that are susceptible to things, because their immune systems on the one side aren't very well developed yet, and on the other hand aren't working so good anymore.
Yeah.
And so I think those are always generally true, and but there are exceptions to that. So I think the picture is not entirely clear. The 1918 influenza pandemic was one that struck healthy, active adults and spared those more traditionally more susceptible groups. So there's no absolute rule, and there are exceptions, and I don't think we know enough right now to say it is less dangerous for young people. We can say it's more dangerous for people over 60.
Yeah.
It's more dangerous for people with underlying health conditions. And when I say protect the vulnerable people, those are the people we're talking about protecting by us not going to the movies and not interrupting this transmission chain, is to protect those. Whether children are actually less susceptible to severe infection or not remains to be seen, in my opinion, but it is possible. And it's also, this again is very speculative. Kids generally get lots of colds and lots of things like that, so it's possible that there is something about their immune responses that's different, that maybe might be beneficial in this one specific instance. But that's, chances are when all the numbers come in, they'll be like, oh yeah, no, this is just like, all the other ones. They're
Sure.
susceptible on the ends and not in the middle, but yeah.
What is the biggest piece of maybe misinformation that you think is out in the public right now that you would like people to know to be true?
Yeah, well, I think there is a range of conspiracy theory type things out there about the origins of the virus. And I just think, I think we don't necessarily know precisely how this landed into the human population, but we do know that this is very similar to coronaviruses that are found in bats, fruit bats, which are like flying foxes. And, it's not unlikely that this virus made it either directly from there into humans or through another, maybe more closely related animal, and then into humans. But that, again, we don't know that, but that's possible. So the conspiracies around the origin of this thing, I think, are concerning. But my big issue really is about when people say things about, well, last year 37,000 people died of the flu, and nobody batted an eye, and now we've got this much smaller number of deaths, and there's panic going on, right? And I think that's very misleading. And I already mentioned about the flu vaccine.
Yes.
We're also exposed to flu all the time. So we have natural immunity to flu. We have a flu vaccine to generate immunity to flu. We have antivirals that, if taken very early, can slow down and stop the progression of a severe influenza infection. So we have a very different toolkit, including our own immune systems, that prevents flu from being more deadly than it could be, right? In 1918, millions of people died. There was no flu vaccine back then. There were no antivirals back then, right? So So this coronavirus is sort of a similar scenario, right? Nobody's been exposed to it. Nobody has immunity to this thing. There's no vaccine to this to induce immunity to this. There's no antivirals that work on this thing. So it's not just like the flu, right?
Sure.
It's not. And I think if the current mortality rate of around 3% holds up, if the same number of people in the United States that got influenza last year get this coronavirus this year, then instead of 37,000 deaths, we'd be close to 1 million deaths. So that's a very big difference as the numbers are right now, and this may not hold once we get all the numbers in. This appears to have a mortality rate about 40 times higher than seasonal influenza. So yes, it spreads like influenza. It's a respiratory infection just like influenza.
But to say it's like the flu is totally misleading in terms of its...
This is new into people, and it's severe in certain people. And I would, if you want to relate it to flu, this is actually more like flu back before we had vaccines and antivirals, right? And that's not the same old seasonal flu like we deal with now with all of our modern tools.
Wow. I am still, even having heard all this information, and I know it's scary because we don't know. It's not like everybody's saying, everybody go hide until May and then everything will be okay. Is there, I know this is kind of speculative again, but could this just be where we don't have gatherings anymore? Like, is that just part of our life now, or is it why will it be safe at some point to come out from
that's a really good it's a very difficult question to answer, but I think that temporarily, I think you're right. This is our new life, right? Don't gather in crowds, be very vigilant about washing your hands and exposing people and that sort of thing. That is our life for now, for the immediate future, and it won't be forever, right? This thing, this thing will. It may not go away, but it's the threat. The public health threat will probably diminish over time, over long periods of time, and so this isn't going to be our way of life forever. But I think, in one regard, the virus needs susceptible people to transmit to. So if we can get it to where all the people who have the virus are unable to transmit that virus to susceptible people, then it will go away, right? Or there's been enough exposure, now the recovered people are all immune, and they're sort of, right, they sort of interrupt the chains of transmission because there's enough people with immunity now, and then the thing kind of goes away. So I think those are the scenarios. It won't be our way of life moving forward forever. It's just certainly in the near term. Yes, absolutely. And this is new, right? We're going to have to choose to sacrifice some civil liberties to protect our vulnerable citizens. I think that's what's going on right now, and that's going to be true at least for the next few months.
I know you mentioned it earlier, but if you could just very plainly tell people where can they go to have a trusted source of real information that they can get on this disease, and especially as it progresses. Again, because like you said, what we know today might not be what we know 3 weeks from now. Where can they trust getting good information from? Yeah,
well, I think that's always challenging. I mean, I think the go-to thing is to Google stuff, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. Mm-hmm. But you need to understand what sources are coming back at you. And so I think, generally speaking, if something ends with .edu or .org, those are going to be more reliable than .com. So if you're looking for virus, medical, clinical information, you should be looking at things that are ending in edu or org and that sort of thing. .gov, right? Those are the reliable sources. So the state of Michigan is a very good source of information. CDC, WHO, those places are reliable if you want to understand, are there cases, what should I be doing? the guidelines are all out there. They're very clear about, you know, if you're over 60, they want you at home. If you have cold symptoms and things like that, whether you think you have coronavirus or not, self-isolate, limit large gatherings, try and limit your travel, and you know, and that sort of thing. I think those are all common sense, good practices, and you know, I think that kind of information is available and out there, and is totally reliable. It's just there is a mix of non-reliable stuff when you go to Google that comes back
Not just
at
with this,
you.
that's also our lives today, right?
That's right.
Probably true with everything.
So I think that's true. And the bottom line is the real hard information that's going to be important to help us understand this disease is going to be happening at the end, right? When we really, really understand how this thing spread and played out. And so it's hard to know those kinds of things in real time.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Alteri, thank you so much for taking the time today to explain to me and to the audience about the coronavirus. I feel like we got a ton of information. You guys out there can find the full interview that you just heard bits of here on our website, movieshowplus.com. And there's a lot of fascinating and great information in there. So again, thank you so much. In the spirit of our talk, I'll just give you one of these.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah, but so great to have you on the show today.
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity. Appreciate that.
Great.